I, 27F, feel trapped in my relationship, 35M, of 6 months or 2 years. Throwaway because we have each other's usernames. I met my boyfriend Fred 2 years ago through a dating website. I was just breaking into being a real estate broker, and he is a very rich man who promised that he could help launch my career. Things were great for a while, but as time went on, stuff kept happening that felt off. First, Fred grew up in a rich family, and sometimes it seems like he has no idea how to behave with people or how to make a good impression because he never has to. I brought him to a networking event, and after an hour of mingling with my boss, he just got bored of it and walked away to go talk to someone else. I was really mad after this, and he apologized, but it was clear he thought he wasn't in the wrong. Fred also dresses in a really shabby way, like wearing Birkenstocks everywhere, and this really grates on me because I think dressing nicely is important, and I always make the effort to look nice for him. Second, and this is more important, he has a really hard time communicating. Fred is really bad at telling people anything he thinks they don't want to hear. So when he's unhappy about something, he just lets it rot and rot under the surface. Things just build up like this, until eventually he explodes and gets really angry. He never gets violent or anything like that, but it's honestly scary because I feel like I never know what he's thinking. I always try to help Fred with stuff by using my professional contacts, but he would just rebuff them in the worst way. One time he was making an investment. I don't want to go into details. It was something pretty weird and it'd give me away, and I wanted to make some introductions that would help him, like bring in people I know in case the people he knew weren't doing a good job. He said that'd be fine, and I got my people ready and told them that he would be doing business with them, and then later he just said that they weren't needed after all, and I was totally humiliated. The worst part was, he eventually walked back all his promises. He was supposed to be the golden key that would finally launch my career, and eventually when I put him in the corner, he admitted that his contacts weren't very good and that all he could do was support me financially while I launched it on my own. Anyway, soon after this, he dumped me. This was awful because I was totally dependent on him at that point. We'd been together for about 6 months, and I wasn't closing any deals as a realtor, and I was relying on him to pay my rent. When he dumped me, I was afraid that I'd be homeless, and I got him to promise that he'd give me some money to live on while I found something else, and to be fair, he did. We tried to be friends for a while, and I knew he regretted dumping me and wanted to get back together, but I started a new relationship with another guy who wasn't comfortable with me seeing Fred. So I told Fred that he was holding me back. He'd helped me a couple of times, and I felt like that was keeping me from really pushing myself, and that we couldn't be friends anymore, and he accepted that. The next few months were absolute hell for me, because my other relationship fell apart. It was definitely abusive, and I was living on credit card debt. Out of the blue, Fred reached out and contacted me to see how he was doing, and we started talking again. We met up a couple of times, and then he said that he really wanted to try things again. I was nervous, but he seemed like he'd really turned over a new leaf, and we'd been having a good time hanging out. So I said we could take it slow and figure things out. I'd also asked if he was interested in an investment play I was working on, and he said he'd look at it when the numbers were ready, so I didn't want to push him away. We were both serious people, so we weren't just going on dates and seeing how things went. That was part of it, but we were talking seriously about the future as well. We both understood it. We were trying to figure out if we could make it for the long term. A few months in, his lease at his old apartment was about to expire, and he was really unhappy with them, which is fair. He told me some horror stories about building management, and he wanted to buy a house. I wanted to help him and to show him how helpful I could be, so I acted as the broker. We found a house he liked, and he asked me, "If things get far enough, would you be happy living in this house?" I looked the place over and said, yes, I could see myself living in this house. But then that deal went through, not Fred's fault or mine, and he found another place that was nearby, and he really liked it. The house wasn't going to work for me. It wasn't as large, and while it was close on the map, the traffic situation would make my commute 15 minutes longer. He didn't even ask about it, though. He just assumed that it would be fine, and bought it even though I didn't like it. Much later, when he talked about it, he told me that he just assumed that if he asked about one house, I would tell him if the other one wasn't okay, and I said that even though I'd never said point blank that I wouldn't live in the second house, I'd said how much I didn't like it and he just wasn't paying attention. He got really hurt by that. The next thing is that I work with a lot of people in the real estate space, and one of them is a contractor, Dan, who had always done good work with me. I recommended Dan to Fred, along with a lot of things that he could do to improve the resale value of the home, and Dan started working. Unfortunately, Dan did a really terrible job. I mean really terrible, like really awful work, and took way too long. And Fred blames me because I was positive about Dan's performance right until the end. I countered by saying that I begged and pleaded to come along to their meetings and was never invited. And if I'd come along, I would have seen that Dan was ordering the wrong stuff and would have realized how badly he was doing. On that note, Fred said that he didn't invite me along because he wanted to support my career, and he knew that it would be a massive commute for me, and he didn't want to pressure me to miss work appointments. I told him that I'd missed a lot more work appointments because I had to come up and scream at Dan to do a better job and supervise him. Fred had to hire a different contractor to come and fix all the stuff that Dan messed up, and it's still not finished after 2 extra months. I recommended a lawyer for Fred to sue Dan. Finally, we get to the ultimate betrayal. Remember I said I'd been working on that investment play? He said that he was interested, but it took months of hard work to get the numbers ready for me to actually show him, and when I did, he refused to invest. He brought his business partner out, and they looked at it together, and they refused to do it. Fred said that he looked at the deal fairly and would have invested if it looked good, but his business partner told me that he and Fred had a private understanding that Fred wouldn't invest unless he did as well, and the business partner was never going to invest because he doesn't even live in the same state as us. So this was all just an excuse to string me along and never actually have the balls to tell me to my face, hey, I don't want to invest in this, because he's so fucking scared of conflict that it's impossible to talk to him. The problem is, now I'm completely dependent on him again. He's never directly tried to push me away from my job, and he swears up and down that he doesn't want to, and he's scared to even get close to that. But I wasted months on that deal, and he was the only person I knew who would be interested in it, and that had huge professional consequences for me. I'm trying to move to a new position at another firm, but in the meantime, I haven't made any closings in a while due to the economy, and I'm relying on him to cover my rent and pay my expenses. It started when I got in a car accident and he bailed me out, and I guess just bit by bit I'm now completely financially reliant on him. Here's the other problem. He doesn't work at all. He's idle rich, and he doesn't do anything that even looks like a job. All he does is go to the gym, watch basketball, play map games on his computer, and go on fishing trips with his friends. He even jokes about not wanting to work. He calls it the W word and says that if work was so great, poor people wouldn't have jobs because the rich would hoard them all. To me, this is a slap in the face, because I believe that work gives you purpose and makes you relatable to people. Fred can be charming for a little while, but he's not relatable. I told him that I didn't want to have children with a man who didn't work because he'd be a bad role model for our children, and even a volunteer job as a janitor would be better than just sitting around. He told me that he'd work on it. He even went out and got a substitute teacher license. But he hasn't actually started working. He says that he's too stressed out about his house. Around the time that he started paying my rent, I had an idea for a business that we could work on together. At first, he seemed enthusiastic, but he just kept pulling back and pulling back. I don't want to go into details, but at first he said he'd do one part of it with me, and then one portion of one part, and finally he was just dragging his feet on it, so I told him not to bother. And he said that was better and he'd just pay for it, and he didn't want to work with me at all. In couples therapy, which we've been doing since we started talking about getting back together, he let it slip that he didn't want to work with me at all because he was afraid that if we did and anything went wrong, I'd just blame him even if it wasn't his fault. He promised me that he would pay all the upfront expenses for my business, and he's paid the first part of it. But there's still 2 more parts. Things have been rocky for a while, but we planned a romantic weekend getaway that was supposed to patch things up. On the first night, though, I had too much to drink, and I spilled that I'd done the investment solely for him and that his rejection of it really fucked up my career. He got really mad and said that it wasn't fair of me to put that on him, and that if he'd known that he was the only person I knew who would take that deal, then he would have told me not to work on it. I said that if he paid attention to my life, he would have known that I didn't have anyone else. I told him that I couldn't deal with how separate he wanted things to be because all I ever wanted, and he knew this, was to work side by side with someone to build something great, and he wanted our lives to be in separate buckets that barely touched. He always made it out like this was a good thing, like he didn't want to interfere with my friends or my job. On the last day, I broke up with him, or at least I tried to. I told him that he and I just weren't compatible and that we should stop wasting our time. At first, he seemed relieved, and it seemed like we could be friends. But later that day, he let it slip that if we were really breaking up, then he wouldn't reach out to his contacts to help me again. This got me scared that he wouldn't support me anymore or pay for the rest of my startup. I tried to float this idea in a subtle way, talking about separation agreements that would work for me, paying for the rest of my startup, helping me find a new place, and a few months of expenses, and he just clammed up. I was afraid that he was going to drop me cold. As we were coming home from the airport, he said that he knew I was going through a stressful time, and if I wanted to just take this all back the next morning, I could. I did. Unfortunately, now he's really unhappy. I went on a business trip for my startup, and even though we were calling and texting every day, he's gotten more and more miserable, and he's not even bothering to hide the fact that he doesn't think we have a future. I'm scared out of my wits. I'm afraid that out of nowhere, he's just going to drop me and I'll be homeless again. I have no idea what to do. I really don't see a future with this man, but at the same time, I'm totally reliant on his support to build my career. I also love him, despite everything, or at least part of me does. What do I do? How can I get things back on track?